And our governing party, the Republican Party, consists of libertarians, and it consists of social conservatives, and it consists of conservatives who are powerful in national security issues. But this coalition doesn't work unless all three organizations work together. So please join me in recognizing Congressman Ron Paul.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. I have great news for the cause of liberty. The country is coming our way. I've always been an optimist. I've always believed the cause of liberty would win. But even 3 or 4 years ago, I would have never predicted that we would have made as much strides as we have now today. So there's every reason for us to be encouraged and to keep the fight, because that's what America is all about. And besides, it's the law of the land, and it can be found in our Constitution, and we demand respect for it. You know, there are 4 categories that I would like to just mention in my opening remarks where we have made strides. But of those 4, probably where we have made the least amount of strides is in our civil liberties. But there's a growing interest because the American people are sick and tired of losing their privacy and being prodded by the TSA at airports and can't get on the airplane. Another area where we have made a lot more stride, and you can see it in the recent debates as well as the recent votes in the Congress, they're coming our way because the American people are sick and tired of the endless no-win wars around the world. And certainly there can be no doubt about the Republican Party and the country coming around to our views that there's too much spending, too much debt, too much borrowing, and it's time to stop the spending. How did you know that was my 4th item? I don't know how you do it. No, this is wonderful. This is where we may have made our greatest strides. For the American people to wake up and realize you can't print papers of money in secrecy by the Federal Reserve and pretend it's the creation of wealth. We have gotten the attention of the American people dealing with our monetary system and the Federal Reserve, and it's time we not only audit the Federal Reserve, but also in due time get rid of the Federal Reserve. You know, a few years ago, 1907 and 08, it was very evident there was a financial bubble, especially the housing bubble, and the bursting of the bubble was on our doorstep. The Austrian free market economists predicted it, and they anticipated, and it did arrive. This has given a lot of credibility to the views of us who look at the Federal Reserve as the culprit in creating the financial bubbles. But when the bailout came, Congress intervened, of course, and spent nearly $1 trillion bailing out the people who were making a lot of money and were bankrupt and deserved to go bankrupt and shouldn't have been bailed out. But what a lot of people didn't know about, and still a few have difficulty understanding it, there was a much bigger bailout by the Federal Reserve. They created about $5 trillion out of thin air. And then they went and they bailed out the banks and the big corporations in total secrecy. And guess what? All those bad assets, those derivatives, and all the assets that were worthless, that nobody could sell in the marketplace, guess what? We, the taxpayers, ended up buying those with money printed out of thin air to the tune of about $2 trillion. The Federal Reserve, during that period of time, and they're capable of doing it. And the reason why we have to address this subject, they can create more money and spend more money than the entire Congress. Curtailing Congress is one thing, but if the people in the Congress do not curtail the Federal Reserve, you won't touch the problem. That is why it's so important. We have had some hearings in my subcommittee on the Financial Services Committee dealing with the Fed. We have gotten more information than ever before. We do not have the audit the Fed bill passed yet, but we will. But we have found out that of all those trillions of dollars created by the Fed, guess what? 1/3 of those funds went to foreign banks. Makes no sense. And we find out that some of those funds actually went to banks partially owned by Gaddafi. Now, if that can make any sense, I don't understand it. But I think the people, once they know about this, will be outraged and are outraged at what has been going on with our monetary system. But today we are facing another crisis. The next crisis that's coming is a result of the Federal Reserve creating all this money, and that will be the inflation tax. When they create money, they inflate the currency, they devalue the currency, and prices will rise, and prices are rising. That is a tax, and that will come. It is coming. It has started, and it's going to be much worse next year. It's going to be a big issue in next year's campaign. Some of you may remember the stagflation of the 70s. It will be worse than the stagflation of the 70s because the economy is weaker now than it was, and you will see prices rising. So for us and for the sake of America, we have to deal with this problem. I have said many times, as other candidates frequently say, we have to do something. We can't dump this on our children and our grandchildren. I address that slightly differently now because it's the current generation, it's us today that are suffering. We don't have the jobs, people are unemployed, and we're getting hit with inflation. We're suffering from the overextension of the wars around the world. So it is today we are suffering from this, and therefore not only should we worry about the next generation, but we have to worry about today's generation. The most precious thing that we can do for our next generation, the debt is a concern, but the most valuable thing that we can give the next generation and allow this generation to have is to have our freedoms back. I have talked a whole lot about foreign policy for a good many years, and it is very, very important because it's the foreign policy originally of the Republican Party, of Robert Taft and others, of non-intervention, of that of neutrality, minding our own business, what the founders taught and what the Constitution says. Don't get involved in entangling alliances. Don't get involved in internal affairs of other nations. Don't get in the business of nation building. And besides, we don't have the money. Now, you know, if somebody's interested in looking at this in detail, one of the most significant pieces of writing that I've ever read about this subject came from Ronald Reagan. And everybody knows, you know, how he stood out in standing up to the Soviets all. But in the early 80s, Ronald Reagan put some troops, Marines, into Beirut. 241 Marines were killed, a real tragedy, and it bore heavy on Ronald Reagan. So what you want to do if you're interested is read what he said in the memoirs. What he said in the memoirs was that he said, and he used these words, he said, "I would not turn tail and run." But when he found out how irrational politics was of that reason, in that region, he decided it was necessary to get out. He said if he had followed a policy of neutrality and a policy where he was more neutral, he admitted, he said, those 241 Marines would still be alive. And I take good advice from Ronald Reagan on this because he was courageous enough to admit the mistake and say and advise us on what we should do. Robert McNamara, when he wrote his memoirs, and he was the one that built up, the Vietnam War. What a tragedy. I was in the military for 5 years in the 1960s. I did not have to go to Vietnam, but I was in the service. And it was such a tragedy. Republicans won in 1968 to stop the war. 30,000 Americans died after we were elected to stop the war. The war ended, we had lost over 60,000 Americans. And McNamara was the champion of the war. More. He had second thoughts. And before he died, he wrote a book and he was interviewed. And the interviewer said, Mr. McNamara, would you like to apologize to the American people about what happened? He says, what good is an apology? He says, the only thing that counts is that we look at policy and change our ways. And that is what we have to do. How long are we going to allow our presidents to go to war in an improper manner? How long are we going to let our governments go to war and the Congress be derelict in their duty? We have not declared war since World War II, and we haven't won a war since World War II. I say if we have to go to war, debate the issue, declare the war, and win it and get it over with. Right now, we're in Libya. Congress was not even asked or informed about it. We have a lawsuit. There's Republicans and Democrats got together filing a lawsuit and say he has broken not only the Constitution, but the War Powers Resolution, which was meant to restrain the presidents from going to war like this. But our current president explained to us in a condescending way to the Congress, oh, this isn't a war. This isn't a war. This one doesn't qualify as being controlled by the Constitution, the Congress, or the War Powers Resolution. He said, they're not shooting back and we haven't been killed. So evidently, if we go and bomb people and they don't shoot back, it's not a war. That's how silly the whole thing is. But it is up to us. It's up to the people. It's up to the Congress. It's up to all of us. And it's up to us to get a president that won't put up with this nonsense and won't go to war so carelessly. A lot of people will ask us as candidates, what would be the first thing you would do? And there's always a limit. Everybody knows what my opinion is on monetary policy, but, a president can't, get rid of the Federal Reserve. He might legalize competition and allow you to use gold and silver like the Constitution says. But the president has a lot to do with foreign policy. He can change foreign policy, and he's in charge of the troops. He's in charge of the Navy. I'll bet there's not too many in this room that read a recent story this week of where our Navy just went with a cruiser, a missile cruiser, went up through the Straits of Bosphorus, up into the Black Sea, and right up on the borders of Russia. And Russia's annoyed. What would we say if China came into the Gulf of Mexico right up to the shores of us? And I know what the Texans would say, or the people in Louisiana will say, we don't need you here.